Continuing our reading in Yellow Eyes by Rutherford Montgomery, Chapter 17, Man Killer. Yellow Eyes traveled far that day, although his pace was slow. He kept on going steadily because of a stiffness which settled upon him when he lay down and rested over long. Toward night he captured a rabbit and ate it. This made him feel that he would be able to stave off starvation. That night a thin moon furnished pale light as he traveled on. He was well up toward the rocky, barren reaches at the edge of timberline by morning. Locating a clump of bushes in a mass of slide rock, he lay down and slept. When he awakened that evening, he was still stiff and sore, but able to move after flexing his muscles and testing them. He leaped upon a log and found that his hindquarters were beginning to function again. Hunting that night afforded him more food. He killed a blue grouse and 2 rabbits. With meat inside him again, the pain in his hips lessened, and he wandered along the mountainside just below tree line. For the next 3 days he hunted small game and stayed close to the inaccessible and rocky cover of the high country, just below the naked peaks of the mountain. He was still unable to strike down deer or to leap and bound as he wished, but he could move readily and did not tire so quickly. Down at Cougar George's cabin, the hunter had a visitor. Mr. Sale had ridden up to see how preparations for the big hunt were progressing. He found Cougar George dressing the wounds Yellow Eyes had inflicted upon the leader of the pack. The hunter looked up and grunted. "Did you locate signs of that big cat?" Mr. Sale asked eagerly. "Sure. I trailed him and come near killing him," Cougar George replied. Sale frowned. "We want that job, Cougar. I have my mind set on that job." It won't be so tough. The big Tom's has been in a fight or a slide and got broken down behind. You ought to be able to pick him up single-handed. I let him go after I had him cornered." Cougar George shoved the hound away from him. "He lit into that dog," Mr. Sale observed. "Yeah, he'll fight, but he's crippled," Cougar George said shortly. "Could I bag him myself?" Mr. Sale asked eagerly. Sure. Trail him a couple days and then kill him." Cougar George squinted up at the sun. "I figure he hit right up to the base of Sleepy Cat Mountain. You could pick up his trail." "That'd be fine." Mr. Sale paused to think. Finally, he slapped his leg. "We'll do just that, you and I. I'll give the boys the laugh when I ride in with his pelt." Sure," Cougar George agreed. "I'll just stay over and we'll have a try," Mr. Sale said. Can we get going today?" "In an hour," Cougar George promised. An hour later, Mr. Sale and Cougar George, with 2 pack animals, Sale's saddle horse and the pack of dogs, left the cabin and headed towards Sleepy Cat Mountain. All day they toiled upward through the spruce. Cougar George headed toward the ridge leading from an inaccessible and rocky rim up toward the ragged peaks of the mountain. He reasoned that Yellow Eyes had headed straight from his cave, which was located under the rocky rim, toward the safety of Sleepy Cat Peaks. They paused beside a sparkling stream to rest and eat their luncheon. So far, the dogs had not scented a fresh cougar's trail. Mr. Sale seated himself upon a hummock beside the stream and dipped up a drink in the brim of his Stetson hat. Cougar George flattened himself and drank the ice-cold water. Cougar George had planned this hunt carefully as they rode upward. He saw a chance of making some extra money out of Mr. Sale. Cautiously, he approached the subject. They were munching thick bread sandwiches, and neither had spoken for some time. You'd like to shoot that big tomcat yourself?" Cougar George tossed the crust of his bread to one of the dogs and finished. Mr. Sale hesitated for a moment. He was not certain he wanted to face the yellow killer. He had seen the cat's tracks and knew him to be the biggest mountain lion in all his experience. Cougar George noticed this hesitation and spoke reassuringly. Yeah, all you gotta do is stay just where I put you and plug the cat when he comes up. He's crippled, and we'll have him pretty well done in by the time he gets to you. You got the best Dawn gun there is, and we don't want you to be very close to him. Mr. Sale grinned quickly. I was not hesitating because I'm afraid of a lion. I was just thinking that we might be playing rather an unsportsmanlike trick on the other fellows. We can go back, Cougar George said. He knew Mr. Sale would not turn back. No, I want to kill that fellow myself. Mr. Sale produced his hand and waved it around. He turned to Cougar George. What's the plan? Well, I'll put you in a spot where you can get a shot, and I'll have your saddle the horse. Can't let the dogs meet up with that cat alone. I won't shoot him. I'll just send him on to you. Cougar George grinned widely. I'll be on foot? Mr. Sale asked doubtfully. You'll be on a ledge. I'll set you up on a big rock where you can get your a rest for your rifle, and where the cat can't get to you. All you got to do is drive a slug through him and wait for me to come up. Cougar George bent forward, his face an expressionless mask. Great! Mr. Sale exclaimed. You once said the cat was worth 500 to you. Cougar George was at the point where he had been working toward. Yeah, he is. You get the 500 after the kill. Mr. Sale held out his hand, and they shook. And you get your tomcat, Cougar George said. They roused themselves and took up the trail again. Cougar George had laid his plans carefully. He would run Yellow Eyes until the big fellow was forced to resort to the trick he had used before. He would rather seek shelter in his cave, planning to slip out through the crevice above and make way, as he had done when Cougar George trailed him a few days ago. But this time Mr. Sale would be planted in ambush at the upper opening, and he could shoot the king cat easily. A red sunset was flaming back of the giant peak when the dogs picked up the first fresh scent they had found. Eagerly they headed along the ridge, but Cougar George called them back and tied them up. He made camp and prepared supper. At dawn the chase would begin, but first he must place Mr. Sale in a bush on the ledge below. That would be done before daylight. The two men sat beside the campfire after a supper of flapjacks and bacon and washed down with black coffee. They had taken a stiff drink of whiskey before eating and were comfortably drowsing. Presently they turned to their blankets and rolled up. That night Yellow Eyes was on a ridge to the north. He faced about and worked slowly back toward his hunting ground. His crippled hindquarters were stronger, but he tired easily. Many times he paused to rest, lying on his belly on a rocky ledge and looking down over the sleepy valley below. The restless urge which had driven him to search for the golden one was beginning to be less pressing, and he had eaten 2 rabbits and was not hungry. Wandering on along the slope, he scented the smoke of a campfire. His natural curiosity led him to work warily down the mountainside toward the site of the camp he suspected would be found beside the fire. It might be the Native American Treon, and Yellow Eyes liked to watch Treon. When he was within 50 yards of the camp on the side where the wind blew to him, his neck scruff bristled. He smelled the hounds, and with it a faint scent which told him Cougar George was in the camp. He turned away at once and moved down the ridge. He did not feel a rush of panic, but he feared the hunter would take his trail if he came upon it. Just before dawn, he located a hiding place and lay down to sleep through the day. Back at the camp, Cougar George was up by 3 in the morning and had roused Mr. Sale. He had a pot of coffee steaming and had opened a can of corned beef. They ate hurriedly and set off down the ridge. Reaching the ledge above the cave, Cougar George went over the ground. He examined the fissure out of which the big cat would leap. With care, he placed Mr. Sale where the sun would be at his back that afternoon. The location was upon a pile of rocks 20 yards from the opening to the cave. The king cat would have to cross a rocky space free from cover. This would give at least 2 clear shots. Cougar George gave gruff instructions. The cat won't show until afternoon or possibly late evening. He may not get around him at all today. If we don't, I'll come down for you. Don't leave the stand no matter what happens. He set a bag of sandwiches and a bottle of water beside a rock. I'll be right here, Mr. Sale promised. And don't make no noise, Cougar George warned. Okay, Sale answered. Cougar unmounted the Sale's horse and rode away. Dawn was lighting the meadows as he came into the camp. The dogs were restless and making a great noise. Cougar George quieted them angrily. He looked at his rifle carefully, then loosed the hounds. The pack spread out and began moving north along the ridge. Cougar George followed them, keeping close upon their heels and checking them when they moved too fast for his horse. The hounds picked up the trail of the big cat where he had paused and sniffed the wood smoke from the campfire. Cougar George dismounted and examined the tracks. He was elated when he saw that the king cat had passed that way during the night. With a shout, he sent the pack off in the direction Yellow Eyes had taken. Such luck in finding the trail seemed to Cougar George's simple mind an omen of success. Several hours later, Yellow Eyes was roused from sleep by the cry of the pack. The sun had swung toward the west. Long shadows trailed away from the spruce and down the steep mountainside. The king cat leaped to his feet and listened. The eager yelps of the hounds carried up to him through the warm afternoon. Lashing his tawny sides with his tail, he slid from the thicket where he had rested and loped deeper into the spruce. His course was round the mountain. Going up the steep slope made his injured hips pain him, so he avoided this course. The pack entered the thicket, and he could hear their wild yelps as they nosed the ground bed where he had lain. Then he heard Cougar George shouting to the dogs. He increased his pace and widened the gap between himself and his pursuers. The pace soon began to tell upon him, and he was forced to slow his leaps to a rapid trot. Following a ridge which led downward, he doubled and crossed a canyon. He kept to steep hillsides and broken rock slides. Twice he halted to watch the pack, and each time he saw the leaping hounds break across timbered hillsides into open meadows, with Cougar George close behind them. He realized that he dare not stand and fight. The deadly gun of the hunter would be with the dogs. This fear drove him on, and he did not halt again to watch his enemies. The sun was still warm and beat down upon the slope with an incessant and cloudless persistence. Yellow Eyes was not accustomed to run in the heat of the day, and he soon found himself harried and wary. This, added to the constant pain in his hips, made him savagely eager to outdistance his pursuers, but he could not shake the hounds from his trail, and always at the heel of the dogs galloped the mounted hunter. On a wind-swept ridge overlooking the valley across which he had just loped, Yellow Eyes paused, his tongue lolling and his sides heaving. He looked back and saw that the hounds were now close behind. He would soon be hard put to keep them from seeing him and charging madly for a final rush. He thought of the cave. It had saved him once when he was sorely pressed. He whirled about and ran, at right angles to the dogs, straight across the side of the mountain. When Cougar George and the pack reached the point where the big cat had doubled back, the hunter was elated. At last, the yellow killer was leading on and heading in the right direction. As the hounds pushed onward, Cougar George was convinced Yellow Eyes was heading for his cave, and he urged the dogs to a faster pace. While the chase was going on, Mr. Sale was keeping to his post. He was tired of sitting still, but he had hunted enough to know that a man placed upon a stand must stay there. However, he had gotten down several times during the day to stretch his legs and for a brief survey of the country below him. When a cramp in his muscles threatened, he got down from his perch and exercised a bit, but he always climbed back and laid his rifle across his knees in readiness. Ahead of the dogs, Yellow Eyes was beginning to tire rapidly. Normally, his bursts of speed were of brief duration, a leaping rush from cover or a rapid charge down a hill in pursuit of small game. Long runs at high speeds always tired him, and now he must fight the added burden of pain in his hind legs that were weak and unsteady. They obeyed his commands, but they pained him and were a drain upon his vitality. He worked down upon the ridge and then swung upward. All thought of doubling and twisting back and forth along the ridge had left his mind. He had ceased to think cunningly about baffling the hounds. His one idea was to reach the cave, pause there until he was forced to leave the shelter, then leap up through the upper opening and slip away. At the foot of the cliff, he paused. The dogs were close behind him now. He could see them racing through the timber. A stiff wind had sprung up and swung their eager cries down the slope away from him. But the sight of them, with Cougar George riding close behind, made him leap to the fallen log and crouch low for the spring to the rim above. He crouched and leaped, landing squarely upon the rim. Cougar George saw him leap and shouted wildly. His voice was carried away by the wind. For a minute, Yellow Eyes faced his enemies, his fangs bared, a snarl in his throat. Then he slipped back from sight and lay down, panting and exhausted. Presently he edged to the rim and looked over. The hounds were gathered at the foot of the cliff. Cougar George had ridden up and dismounted. He swung his rifle over his back and began climbing toward the crevice up which he had come the first time he had attacked the cave. Yellow Eyes waited until the hunter was halfway up the cliff, then got to his feet and slipped back into the gloom of the cave. He leaped up into the narrow opening leading to the top of the rim. Pausing just short of the white light beyond, he drew himself together. He meant to run far once he had shaken the hounds from his trail. Thrusting himself from the cave, he halted a moment. His tail lashed and his eyes flamed. Before him stood a man, rifle in hand, not 20 feet away. Mr. Sale had gotten down from his lookout place to work a cramp out of his leg. He stood frozen with surprised panic and stared at the great king cat crouching before him. He had never seen so magnificent a specimen in his life. The great shoulders and powerful hind legs, the massive paws spread wide, with lance-like claws gripping the rock floor beneath his feet, and the bared fangs of the yellow killer all stamped themselves upon his mind. He jerked his rifle upward frantically. Yellow Eyes lowered his belly toward the rock under him. He was cornered. Back of him was the deadly rifle of Cougar George. Before him was another man with a rifle. Rage filled him, a desperate anger that lifted a snarling cry from his lips. In a moment, the rifle in the hands of the man cracked. The bullet went wide and screamed harmlessly out of the valley. In that instant, Yellow Eyes leaped straight upon his tormentor. His hurling bulk struck Mr. Sale and crushed him to the ground. The hated rifle rattled away across the rocks and slipped over the rim. The fangs of the yellow killer found the man's shoulders and sank deep. Lifting himself, he shook the limp body and hurled it from him. A blow from his forepaw slashed the man's cap from his head and raised two great welts on one cheek. Mr. Sale lay still. For a moment, the big cat glared at the prostrate man. Then, thinking him dead, he leaped to cover. Straight up the slope he went, driving himself on in spite of the pain and weariness in which dragged at his vitals. Cougar George found Mr. Sale laying on his back unconscious. He poured water from his canteen into the face of the hunter. A hurried examination showed that Mr. Sale was not badly injured. Finally, the wounded man opened his eyes and sat up. That brute is a man-killer, he gasped weakly. He jumped on me. You should have stayed put up in them rocks, Cougar George answered. He found little sympathy for Mr. Sale. All you had to do was take him on a pot shot. I got a cramp in my leg. I got down to walk it out, and I thought I'd have a look down the hole that cat was to come out of. Mr. Sale settled back weakly. Got any whiskey? Cougar George produced a bottle, and Mr. Sale drank deeply. He passed his hand over his cheek. I'll be marked for life, he groaned. I reckon, Cougar George agreed gruffly. Want I should wash them cuts? Sometimes a cat scratch is bad. Mr. Sale's wounds were dressed, and the two men made their way down to where the hounds were baying eagerly. After he had mounted his horse, Sale spoke again. That lion is a man-killer, no mistake. We have to finish him. I'm getting a pack of Airedales in here. About a dozen of those babies will handle him. Your hounds can trail him, and the Airedales will finish him. No, that makes sense. If you got enough of them bear dogs, they'll kill them for sure. Cougar agreed. And so it came about that Yellow Eyes became a man killer and was doubly marked for destruction. That's the end of chapter 17.